accidents that have deformed astronauts' bodies, missions that have almost been destroyed by weather conditions, and even sensory deprivation tests that almost ended with a fatal outcome. These are 5 creepy things that have happened to astronauts. Number 5. Panic out of orbit. Our first stop takes us back to March 18, 1965, when cosmonauts Alexei Leonov and Pavel Belyayev were about to make history. Both had it in their hands to complete a momentous mission. They would be the first man to take a spacewalk around the Earth's orbit. The Russian spacecraft called Voskhod 2 had been one of the Soviet Union's latest breakthroughs in its intense space race. The goal was to overtake the United States, and although the spacecraft had suffered a large number of failures, it managed to cross the Earth's borders. However, once they left our planet's atmosphere and exited the spacecraft to float through space, something strange began to happen in Leonov's body. The cosmonaut almost immediately experienced a pressurization problem. The suit seemed to be leaking and the vacuumous space was seeping in. His suit began to swell at an accelerated rate. His hands were squeezing his gloves so tightly that they were about to tear, and as the seconds ticked by, Leonov was convinced that the suit would leave him exposed and without oxygen in the middle of space. In the midst of that crossroads, Leonov released his oxygen cable. For more than a minute, he was on the verge of deathly asphyxiation, but this slight action allowed the suit to begin to deflate. Once he regained a halfway normal size, Alexei, his mission partner, managed to return him to the spacecraft and save his life. The event lasted no more than 5 minutes, but it was one of the most chilling space accidents of that decade. Number 4. An oxygen leak. Another year that gave a lot to talk about was 1997, when Vasily Sivaliev was leading a recovery mission via the unmanned spacecraft Progress. This was a routine task. It wasn't supposed to present any setbacks. After all, he was used to supplying the Mir space station. However, in the middle of the unmanned spacecraft entry into the station's hold, a miscalculation on Vasily's part caused a real disaster. The spacecraft crashed into the walls of the space station, cracking the metal and causing a massive oxygen leak. It was a dramatic situation. The space station workers were quickly affected. Oxygen was escaping from the spacecraft at an alarming rate, and catastrophe seemed assured. Fortunately, Michael Foale, one of the station leaders, took a series of actions that allowed him to isolate the affected section from the rest of the spacecraft. As a result, the oxygen leak was brought under control, and a catastrophe that could have claimed the lives of hundreds of astronauts was averted. Number 3. Deadly experiment. In the life of an astronaut, accidents often occur in unexpected situations. Despite the fact that there are hundreds of people monitoring and watching every detail, sometimes everything turns into chaos in a matter of seconds. A clear example of this can be found in the experience of Valentin Bondarenko, a 24-year-old future cosmonaut who was being tested for the space program in 1961. His dream was to become an astronaut, and to do so, he underwent several tests. One of them revolves around the sensory deprivation chamber. This controlled area stimulates the extreme isolation that outer space produces in cosmonauts. During the test, the candidates were locked in this chamber for several days, and gradually, the stimuli coming from the outside were reduced to a minimum. Usually, these tests didn't cause many problems, but Bondarenko was the exception. After 10 days in the chamber, Bondarenko made a mistake that almost cost him his life. Within minutes of finishing the test, he used a few alcohol-soaked pads to remove the stickers from the sensors attached to his body. When he tried to get rid of them, he threw them in the wrong place. The pads leaked into one of the oxygen channels feeding the chamber, and the blockage quickly generated a short circuit. The explosion surprised the technical team. No one knew what was happening, but it got worse when the chamber started to catch fire. Bondarenko wasn't only at the mercy of the fire, but he was losing oxygen second by second. Everything seemed to be leading him to a horrible end, but fortunately, They managed to remove him from the chamber with only minor burns. The incident was recorded in history and marked a before and after in this sensory test that almost cost the life of one of its practitioners. Number 2. The mission that almost failed. The arrival of man on the moon is one of the most important milestones in modern history. No wonder we are all familiar with Apollo 11. However, there's a story about its successor that very few people know. It was the sixth manned mission powered by NASA. Apollo 12 was scheduled to lift off on November 14, 1969, and despite weather hazards threatening the mission in the vicinity of Kennedy Space Center in Florida, launch went ahead. 36 seconds later, something impossible happened. Lightning struck the spacecraft's metal structure. The crew was quickly shaken by the catastrophe, but the systems managed to withstand the impact. From the ground base, the monitoring team breathed a sign of relief, but it didn't last long. A minute later, the second bolt of lightning struck in exactly the same position as the previous one. This time, there was no such luck. The beam knocked the ship's systems out of commission. The danger was very real. The mission was still ascending, passing through the layers of the Earth, but with its systems completely shut down. It was a race against the clock. If the spacecraft left orbit without fixing that problem, it would be the end for the astronauts. Their lives were in danger and the Earth base had no way to save them. Fortunately, John Aaron, an engineer who had recently joined the NASA team, found the key. After several attempts and great efforts, they managed to restore the spacecraft systems. Years later, John Aaron would become the director of the International Space Station. Number 1. A lethal test. The Cold War was one of the most aggressive and intimidating silent events in history. In the midst of the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union were working with all their resources to create the technology that would take them into space. This generated great advances, but also terrifying moments. One of them involved Malcolm Ross and Victor Prather, two test pilots who were selected to conduct a series of experiments with new space technologies by the US government. Each was given a prototype spacesuit that would soon be worn by astronauts. To test it, they were taken to a high altitude via hot air balloons and the results were measured. However, the test became more and more daring. The balloons went higher and higher, even to a great altitude above the Earth's upper atmosphere. The test had certain dangers, of course, but they went smoothly, at least until they landed in the Gulf of Mexico. The impact was so strong that Prather was thrown out of the balloon basket and fell into the sea. Water began to seep through his suit. His body was unable to float and slowly filled with water. His partner Malcolm could only witness the tragedy. Prather's helmet filled with water and drowned him to death. Surprising as it may seem, such accidents were common. The exact number of pilots and astronauts who died in hundreds of tests is unknown. Casualties were part of the demands of the time. The race to reach the moon was a priority, and both the US and Soviet governments were willing to sacrifice whatever it took. Interestingly, when both achieved their goal over that accidents outside could be much worse. The universe is full of tragedies, though few know it. The stories behind the astronauts who never returned are rarely heard. They do exist, and if you join us in the following videos, you too can discover them.